I'm J.C. Hallman. I grew up in Southern California. I've bounced around a good bit in my life, lived in New Jersey, Baltimore, Minnesota, Virginia, and I attended the Writers' Workshop in 1989 to 1991 and lived here a couple of times since then, and am in Iowa City currently to read here and in Cedar Rapids from my book about the correspondence of William and Henry James. I think my work in general, it's hard to find a consistent trajectory from book to book, so I hear that a lot, having written about chess and religion and now the James brothers, and I'm working on a book about Nicholson Baker, will probably be my next project. It's not always clear what the thread is. Perfectly clear to me, but for other people it looks a little peculiar. And the James in particular is kind of part of that trajectory. I worked on a thesis in graduate school. This was my second time around in graduate school at Johns Hopkins on Henry James's The Turn of the Screw. Some years after that, I wrote a book about William James's ongoing influence on the American religious topography via his book, The Varieties of Religious Experience. And in the process of writing that book, came into possession of his collected correspondence, which included the 3 volumes of their collected letters, which sat in my house for a number of years before I had the opportunity to write the book that I'm here to pitch and sell. But it kind of feeds into that idea of the trajectory that I get asked about, because it goes back a long, long way with separate projects on each of the James brothers that then finally culminated in this one, which is about both. Well, I think the business of writing and literature practically discourages us from thinking on that level. If you think about the practice of reviewing books, there's very much a kind of thumbs up, thumbs down mentality, as though what we do as readers is sift through other writers' work, looking for the ones that really rise above the pack, as though all the books are failures except for the few that come to stand for a writer's career. And I don't think that's how it feels as you produce a series of books. I think they all feel like part of a consistent trajectory. But I don't think we get encouraged to read in that way, and I think that's unfortunate. I think it's true too that the business of literature encourages people to pigeonhole themselves inside a particular subject. So Michael Pollan writes about food, Karen Armstrong writes about religion. You don't expect them to branch out and do other things. So writers who do have varied careers sometimes run afoul or run up against an expectation among readers that they'll simply be a one-subject career, and if you're not, it looks confusing. But my own imagination just it necessarily wanders and meanders, and I get drawn into a subject, explore it hopefully pretty exhaustively, and then want almost nothing to do with it. No, not particularly. I mean, I write in the same place. I have an office, and I actually have tinnitus in one ear, so I have to be sure to figure out how to mask that, and I have various strategies for that. And in recent years, I've been using a kind of white noise program that lets me create I'll be able to combine different noises like thunder and beach and fire, and and you sort of create this kind of impossible set of stimuli, which then wind up becoming sort of hooked into my imagination. So when I start hearing that, I'm like Pavlov's dog. Suddenly I'm in writing mode, and I don't know why that is. And some of it is just because my partner is sitting in the next room, and I read out loud a lot as I work, and so she wants there to be some noise just to cover up my voice. And so it's not particularly quiet, but it is kind of sacred in its way. I don't think so. I mean, I think in terms of either reading or writing, I think because it's a mental space, and I think that I think I've cultivated an ability to block things out. Generally, being alone is good, though sometimes I've had very good experiences reading on airplanes, for example, when you're surrounded by people and there's noise, and the work itself can become the way in which you detach yourself from the situation you're in, and that can be good. Well, Henry and William James, often talked about this, and they wanted to propose again and again and again that any kind of prolonged work with words or language exacted a kind of toll, and what they wanted to do was simply get away from any kind of exposure to the use of language, talking or writing or whatever. And so William James in particular would do a lot of mountain climbing and as a way of recharging his batteries. For me, I find that driving really helps, that it takes me kind of into a different kind of trance state, and it will wind up triggering my imagination in a way that won't happen if I'm just sitting in one place. So road trips are a thing that I will do, but it's generally not the destination, but the actual driving and moving that winds up making that emotional progress. Certain kinds of words, just. I'm really interested in the word only lately, not because I always cut it, but because I've been thinking a lot about how flexible English is, and how in any given sentence where you're using the word only, it can almost fit in any slot between words and it'll still work as a sentence. But I use just a lot and yet, and as a teacher, it's kind of a separate theory, but I think we're actually very good, if you're a teacher of writing and literature, that you are very good at pointing out in the work of others the mistakes that you yourself tend to make. And I think that my over-reliance on words like just and yet are what I call artificial segues, when you're trying to introduce a sense of logical progression when there isn't one yet. And you can throw those words in, and I often find myself cutting those later and needing to go back and make sure that the sentences build off of one another. But it's those little connecting words that give an illusion of sense, but really don't make any sense. Yeah. Well, I think as far as teachers go, I studied with Frank Conroy here at the workshop, and with Deborah Eisenberg, and I think those two in particular are still in the back of my mind pretty consistently as voices that I think about a lot. As a writer, I think a lot about in my nonfiction writers like Bruce Chatwin, that is somebody who is writing kind of narrative travel journeys, which I often do. This book is a bit of a departure from that, but which have a kind of heady, critical component. You're not just describing your experiences, you're critiquing them as though they have meaning unto themselves. And so he's an example, but just one of many that and I think we all compile our writerly identities out of not just one or two people that we think about a lot, but out of our whole libraries. Well, I just had the real great good fortune of being named a Guggenheim Fellow for 2013, and that is an incredible honor, and it's also very daunting because I won it for a project that I've wanted to do for a long, long time, and that's this. It's a travel narrative about a small country in southern Africa called Swaziland, and that one has really haunted my imagination for a long, long time, and now that I really have the opportunity and the means to do it, I'm feeling pretty daunted but excited about the prospect. I guess it would depend on how you define that. I think when I wrote about William James and his own thinking on religion, he's the founder of pragmatism, the philosophy of pragmatism. And pragmatism is a method for a kind of new definition of truth. He argued that our definition of truth didn't work particularly well because even though we all had this one singular idea of truth, there was still this bevy of ideas about what was true. So to his mind, clearly truth as it was defined didn't work, and he wanted a new definition. He wanted a definition of truth that would enable a true pluralistic spirit. And I think, I kind of came to accept that, So, pragmatism is not a religion. and arguably it's not even really a philosophy. But nevertheless, it gives you a kind of an equanimity, which was an important word for William James in terms of what a religion was supposed to provide. And so it was, if I went into writing about religion in William James out of some sense of a quandary, some sense of confusion about what religion was for in the world, I came out of it in the other end with having achieved some kind of equanimity that came about as a function of recognizing that Jamesianism offered something. And so I wouldn't really call it a spirituality, but it's the closest I can probably come. I think that's a good question. I kind of like those really fundamental questions that really ask people to consider the basic purpose of literature and what is all this for, because I think it's something we don't really talk about nearly enough. And I would say that a writer is someone who has decided to dedicate themselves not only to a life of the mind, but who has, with a practically utopian verve, decided to dedicate themselves not just to thinking, but to expanding the possibilities of what thought can accomplish and sharing it with others in some way. It seems to me to be an incredible act of generosity to decide to become a writer, because you have so many incredibly brilliant people who could do anything that they wanted. They're brilliant. They probably could decide to be anything or do anything, and decide to undertake this lifelong project that doesn't really offer many people much by way of remunerative reward. And I find that to be incredibly heartening, that there are so many people who decide to dedicate themselves to thought and to sharing what progress they're able to make.